I watched in stunned silence as a line of heavy bulldozers crawled up the gravel road toward my quiet mountain retreat, their engines growling like hungry beasts. The air smelled of pine and fresh snow, but the sound of metal tearing earth crushed any sense of peace. My heart pounded as the lead machine lowered its blade toward the cedar walls of my mansion, the home I built with my own hands. The HOA claimed I owed them a mountain of fines for violations I never agreed to, and today they had come to destroy everything I loved. Neighbors stood at a distance, whispering and recording on their phones, while the HOA president smirked as if she owned the entire mountain. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my property wasn't just another private home. They were demolishing something far bigger, and their mistake was about to change everything. The morning began, like any other on the mountain, quiet, crisp, and alive with the smell of pine sap warming in the early sun. I had woken to the sound of chickadees tapping at the feeder outside my bedroom window and the gentle rush of wind through the evergreens. From my deck, the world looked endless. Below me stretched a carpet of forest, glowing gold where the rising light struck the treetops. Peaks rose like watchful sentinels around the valley, their snowy crowns glittering against a deep blue sky. Living here was supposed to be my reward, a hard-earned peace after decades of city noise and endless deadlines. I had worked 4 years late nights, missed holidays, and sacrificed weekends just to stand where I stood now. Coffee steaming in my hand, breathing air that tasted of freedom. But that morning, the mountain carried a different energy. The air was colder than usual, and the silence beneath the birdsong felt wrong. I noticed it first as a low vibration beneath my feet, subtle but steady, like a distant thunderstorm trapped underground. The boards of the deck trembled against my slippers. At first I thought it was a small tremor. Earthquakes weren't common here, but they weren't unheard of. Then came the unmistakable growl of diesel engines winding their way up the gravel road below. I set my mug down and leaned over the railing, squinting through the trees. What I saw turned the morning bitter in an instant. A convoy of yellow bulldozers and heavy trucks snaked through the pines, sunlight flashing off their metal skins. Dust rose in a choking cloud behind them, swirling through the shafts of light like smoke. At their head was a black SUV with tinted windows, crawling forward like a predator leading the hunt. My stomach dropped. There was only one road to my property, a narrow lane I'd kept private for years. No one came up that way without a reason. I grabbed my jacket and ran for the front door, heart thudding so hard it drowned out the engine start. By the time I reached the driveway, the first machine had broken through the tree line. Its massive blade gleamed in the sun as it slowed to a stop, crushing the gravel under its treads. Behind it came more 4, maybe 5 bulldozers, each followed by a truck carrying men in neon vests and hard hats. They looked like an invading army, their faces blank beneath mirrored sunglasses. The air filled with the acrid stench of diesel, sharp and oily, coating the back of my throat. And then I saw her, Karen Whitmore, president of the High Ridge Homeowners Association, stepped out of the black SUV like a queen surveying her conquest. Even from a distance, I recognized her stiff posture and the sharp bob of her platinum hair. She wore a tailored blazer far too formal for a mountain morning and a pair of heeled boots that sank slightly into the gravel. Behind her, a man in a gray suit carried a clipboard and followed her every move like a nervous shadow. Karen's eyes scanned the house, my house, with a look of cold satisfaction. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted, striding toward the gate. My voice echoed off the trees, startling a pair of crows into flight. Karen gave a thin smile, as if she had been waiting for me. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice crisp and annoyingly cheerful, "you've ignored multiple notices regarding your outstanding fines. As of this morning, the HOA has taken action to enforce compliance." "Compliance?" I repeated, barely able to process the word. "You brought bulldozers to my property?" "This property," she said smoothly, "falls under the jurisdiction of the High Ridge Association. You have repeatedly refused to pay fines for violations, including but not limited to no authorized construction, non-standard exterior finishes, and failure to adhere to landscaping guidelines. Our board voted unanimously to proceed with removal of the non-compliant structure." I stared at her, disbelief boiling into anger. "This is private land. My deed is on file with the county. You don't have the authority to so much as set foot on this driveway, let alone demolish my home." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Our legal team disagrees. You were given ample opportunity to resolve the matter. Your silence is considered refusal." She turned to the man with the clipboard. "Proceed." The bulldozer's engine roared to life, drowning out my shout of protest. The sound was deafening, a metallic growl that rattled my teeth. I scrambled to block the path, but 2 uniformed men stepped forward, their hard hats glinting. They weren't police, but they carried themselves with the same cold authority. One held up a folded piece of paper, some kind of notice stamped with an official-looking seal. "Step aside, sir," the man said flatly. "This operation is authorized." "Authorized by who?" I demanded. "The HOA doesn't outrank the state of Colorado." "Sir," he repeated, his tone mechanical, "please step aside." For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind racing through every possibility. Could they really do this? Was there some obscure legal loophole they were exploiting? My attorney had warned me that HOS could be relentless, But demolition? This wasn't enforcement, it was war. Neighbors began to appear along the ridge, drawn by the noise. I spotted familiar faces, some curious, some openly delighted. A few held their phones up, recording the scene like it was a roadside spectacle. I could almost hear their whispered gossip. He thought he was above the rules. Look where it got him. My blood burned. Karen, this is illegal, I said, stepping closer until I could see my reflection in her sunglasses. If you do this, you'll regret it. She tilted her head, lips curling in a smirk. We're simply protecting the value of our community. You brought this on yourself. With a sharp nod, she signaled to the operators. The bulldozer lurched forward, its blade lowering with a hiss of hydraulics. I felt the ground tremble as it approached the front deck, the very spot where I had stood sipping coffee less than an hour ago. The first strike was like a gunshot. Wood splintered with a deafening crack as the blade punched through the railing, sending shards flying into the air. I shouted again, but my voice was lost beneath the machine's roar. Another strike followed, then another, each one tearing away pieces of the life I had built. The cedar siding groaned as nails popped and windows shattered. Glass sprayed across the gravel in a glittering arc. I stumbled back, helpless, watching years of sweat and sacrifice reduced to rubble in minutes. Every board and beam carried memories. The nights I spent sanding floors by hand, the weekends spent hauling stone for the fireplace, the quiet mornings when the sunrise painted the walls gold, all of it crushed beneath steel treads. Karen stood with her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the destruction like an artist admiring her masterpiece. I wanted to scream, to grab her by the shoulders and make her see what she was doing, but rage tangled with shock until I could barely breathe. My fists clenched so tightly my nails cut into my palms. The demolition stretched into hours. By midday, the mansion was nothing but a skeletal frame, its proud walls flattened into heaps of timber and shattered glass. The smell of diesel mixed with the acrid scent of torn insulation, thick and nauseating. Workers moved methodically, tearing down what little remained with the cold efficiency of men accustomed to breaking things at one point. I caught sight of a man in a brown jacket standing at the tree line, separate from the crowd of gawkers. He held no phone, made no sound, just watched. When our eyes met, he gave the slightest nod before disappearing back into the forest. I didn't know him, but something about his presence, almost deliberate, burned into my mind. By late afternoon, silence returned. The bulldozers powered down, their engines ticking as they cooled. Dust hung in the air like a dirty fog, settling over the ruins of what had once been my home. Karen approached, her heels clicking sharply against the gravel. This is what happens, she said softly, almost sweetly, when someone thinks the rules don't apply to them. I wanted to speak, to curse her, to threaten every legal weapon I had, but words felt useless against the weight of what I had just witnessed. Instead, I locked eyes with her and let the fury show. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the shock, a spark of resolve ignited. This wasn't over. As the last truck rumbled down the mountain road and the sun dipped behind the peaks, I stood alone amid the wreckage. The wind returned, carrying the scent of pine and the faint echo of engines. My house was gone, but the mountain remained, solid and eternal. Karen believed she had one, but she didn't know the truth about this land. She didn't know who truly owned the ridge she had just invaded. And as the shadows deepened around me, I made a silent promise. This mountain would remember, and so would I. Night fell heavy over the mountain, but sleep never came. I lay in the small cabin down the slope, a caretaker's hut. I kept 4 guests listening to the forest breathe and the broken timbers of my ruined mansion settle under the cold moonlight. Each creak of shifting rubble felt like a taunt, a reminder that everything I'd built had been reduced to a heap of splintered wood and shattered stone. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind churned restlessly, replaying every sound of the demolition in brutal clarity. The crash of beams snapping, the hiss of hydraulic blades cutting through walls, the mocking cadence of Karen's voice as she spoke of compliance. I had always known the HOA was a thorn in my side, but this was more than harassment, it was an assault. I turned over in bed, staring at the rough wooden ceiling of the caretaker's cabin. Rage boiled inside me, threatening to spill into reckless action, but anger alone would not rebuild my home, and it certainly wouldn't bring the HOA to justice. I needed clarity, strategy, and proof. At first light, I dressed in silence and stepped outside. The morning air carried a sharp bite, crisp and clean despite the lingering smell of diesel. A thin frost glittered on the fallen pine needles, crunching beneath my boots as I climbed the hill toward the ruins. The forest around me seemed strangely alive with whispers. Birds hopped from branch to branch, their calls sharp and restless, as if they sensed the violence that had scarred the mountain. When I reached the clearing, the sight of my home, or what remained of it, hit me with renewed force. The mansion that had once stood like a proud sentinel now lay in heaps of gray rubble. Twisted beams jutted skyward like broken ribs. Windows that once framed sweeping views of the peaks were nothing but jagged shards glittering in the early light. The stone fireplace, my favorite feature, had collapsed into a mound of ash-stained rocks. I stood there for a long time, fists buried in my jacket pockets, forcing myself to absorb the full weight of the destruction. That's when I heard a crunch of gravel behind me. My heart leaped, and I spun around, ready to confront whoever dared set foot on my land again. But it wasn't Karen or one of her bulldozer crew. A tall man in a brown jacket emerged from the trees. The same figure I had glimpsed during the demolition. He carried no tools, no clipboard only, a leather satchel slung across his shoulder. "Morning," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "Mind if I come closer?" I studied him carefully. He looked to be in his 40s, clean-shaven, with eyes that carried a sharp intelligence beneath their easy warmth. Something about him seemed familiar, though I couldn't place it. "Depends on who you are," I said, my tone guarded. He stopped a few feet away and offered a faint smile. "Name's David Collins, State Land Management." He tapped the badge clipped to his jacket pocket. "I was in the area yesterday when the demolition started. Thought you might need someone to talk to." "State Land Management," I repeated, my suspicion sharpening. Why would someone from the state be out here? "Routine inspections," he said with a shrug. But when I saw what was happening, well, let's just say it caught my attention. Especially considering this property isn't exactly standard private land. My chest tightened. There it was, the truth I had kept mostly to myself. "What do you mean by that?" I asked carefully. David's smile thinned. "Let's not play games, Mr. Grant. This land isn't under HOA jurisdiction. In fact, it's not even fully private property. It falls within a special trust agreement with the state a trust established decades ago for environmental preservation and research. Whoever sold it to you must have explained that." I nodded slowly, memories stirring of the day I bought the property. My old friend, Mark Daniels, had been the intermediary, a senior advisor in the governor's office. He'd assured me the arrangement came with unique protections, limited development rights, tax benefits, and, most importantly, immunity from neighborhood governance. It was why I had paid top dollar to secure it. "I know," I admitted, "but the HOA doesn't seem to care." "That," David said, his voice turning crisp, "is a very big problem for them." He stepped closer, scanning the ruins with a professional eye. "Do you have documentation? Deeds, trust agreements, anything that proves the exemption?" "In my office," I said, "or what used to be my office. Some of it might still be intact." David nodded. "We'll need to recover whatever we can. The state takes violations like this very seriously, especially when public trust land is involved. If the HOA acted without jurisdiction, their demolition wasn't just illegal, it was criminal." For the first time in 24 hours. A spark of hope flared inside me. "Criminal," I repeated, tasting the word like a promise. David gave a single, firm nod. "The governor will want to know about this immediately." The name struck me like a bell. Governor Alan Piersmark's longtime ally and the man who had personally approved my trust deed. The governor wasn't just a distant politician. He was a friend, someone who valued the preservation of these mountains as fiercely as I did. If he knew the HOA had torn down a house protected by the trust, he wouldn't stand idle. We spent the next hour sifting through the wreckage, searching for anything salvageable. The air was cold and filled with the sharp scent of crushed pine and wet earth. My gloves quickly grew dusty as I dug through piles of splintered wood and cracked tiles. Finally, beneath a partially collapsed section of roof, I uncovered a metal lockbox bent but intact. My heart hammered as I pried it open. Inside, protected by a few damp papers and a scorched envelope, lay the original trust deed and a series of letters from Mark Daniels himself, each one bearing the official state seal. David examined the documents with careful hands, his eyes narrowing with each page. "This is perfect," he said finally. "Clear proof of state oversight. The HOA didn't just overstep, they bulldozed protected land. That's felony-level destruction of government property." The weight of his words settled over me like the first warm ray of sun after a storm. Felony. The HOA had been smug, confident, and reckless, but now the mountain itself seemed to shift in my favor. "We'll need to move quickly," David continued. "The governor's office will open in a few hours. I can contact my director and arrange a direct briefing. In the meantime, do not engage with the HOA. No phone calls, no confrontations. Let the state handle this." A bitter laugh escaped my throat. "Karen's not going to stay quiet. She spin this as some kind of victory." David's eyes sharpened. "Let her. Every word she says will only make the state's case stronger." As the morning sun climbed higher, we carefully packed the documents into David's satchel. The forest around us grew brighter, the frost melting into glittering droplets that dripped from the pine needles. For the first time since the bulldozers arrived, I felt the mountain breathe again, its silent strength flowing back into my veins. Before leaving, I took one last look at the ruins of my home. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it carried a focus. Karen thought she had erased me, but she had only awakened something far more powerful. Back at the caretaker's cabin, David pulled out a secure phone and stepped outside to make his call. Through the window, I watched him speak in low, urgent tones, his free hand gesturing toward the destroyed mansion. Though I couldn't hear the words, the expression on his face told me enough. This wasn't a routine report. It was a warning, a spark that could ignite a fire far bigger than Karen Whitmore could imagine. When David finally re-entered the cabin, he wore a faint, almost satisfied smile. "Governor Pierce has been briefed," he said. "He's furious. He's arranging a site visit today, if possible. The word sent a rush of adrenaline through me. Today, David confirmed. He wants to see the damage for himself. And when he does, the HOA will have nowhere to hide. I sank into a chair, the wooden frame creaking beneath me, and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt the weight of the mountain shift back into balance. The HOA had brought bulldozers to a fight they thought they owned. But they hadn't just attacked me, they had attacked the state, the trust, and the governor himself. As David packed up his satchel, he paused and met my eyes. "Mr. Grant," he said quietly, "you're not alone in this. The law is on your side, and trust me, the state doesn't take kindly to someone tearing down the governor's house." The phrase struck deep, a revelation that sent a shiver down my spine. My home wasn't just my sanctuary, it was, in legal terms, the governor's house. Karen and her board hadn't simply destroyed a private residence, they had demolished a piece of government property. I stood and looked out the window, watching the sunlight spill across the broken beams and shattered stone. For hours, I had felt powerless, but now the truth burned bright inside me. The HOA thought they had buried me beneath rubble, but they had only dug their own grave. That as the wind stirred the trees and carried the scent of pine through the cabin, I allowed myself a small, grim smile. The mountain was patient. Justice, like the rising sun, was already on its way. The mountain air carried a restless tension as the sun climbed over the peaks the next morning. I stood on the gravel drive outside the caretaker's cabin, coffee cooling in my hands, watching the trail of dust rising from the long road below. David had called early, his voice clipped with urgency. The governor was on his way. Despite the warmth of the rising sun, a chill threaded through me. Part of me still couldn't believe it. Governor Alan Pierce, the most powerful man in the state, coming to a remote mountain ridge because of what the HOA had done. From my vantage point, the world felt both vast and impossibly small. The forest stretched for miles, an ocean of green broken only by silver streams and the occasional bald patch of rock. Yet all eyes neighbors state officials, and, no doubt, the HOA were narrowing in on this one scarred clearing where my house had stood. The thought made my chest tighten. This wasn't just about me anymore. The stakes had grown higher overnight. Around mid-morning, the first black SUVs appeared on the distant road, their polished frames gleaming like obsidian against the pine. They moved in tight formation, deliberate and slow, each turn of their wheels sending tiny clouds of dust spiraling into the cool air. My pulse quickened. The convoy wound its way up the gravel path, engines low and steady, until the lead vehicle pulled into the clearing. Doors opened in near-perfect unison. Men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the area with the sharp, methodical movements of trained security. Then the rear door of the central SUV swung open, and Governor Alan Pierce emerged. He looked much the same as I remembered from our last meeting years ago, tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that carried quiet authority. His silver hair caught the sunlight, giving him an almost regal glow, but it was his eyes that held me. They were sharp, assessing, and filled with a controlled anger I hadn't seen before. He paused, breathing in the crisp mountain air as he surveyed the ruins. Then he approached with the deliberate steps of a man who already understood far more than he was saying. "Grant," he said, his voice deep and steady, extending his hand. "I wish I were here under better circumstances." "Governor," I replied, gripping his hand firmly, "I appreciate you coming." His gaze swept over the destruction. David briefed me on the situation, but seeing it in person, he shook his head, jaw tightening. "It's worse than I imagined." I followed his eyes to what remained of my home. The bulldozers had left nothing untouched. The cedar beams lay twisted and blackened from the friction of steel blades. The stone fireplace, once the heart of the house, was now a pile of cracked rubble. Only the mountain itself remained untouched, a silent witness to the chaos that had unfolded. Governor Pierce crouched to pick up a splintered piece of siding, running his thumb over the grain as though reading a story in the wood. "This property," he said quietly, "is not just yours. It's part of a state trust, which means these people didn't just trespass, they destroyed government-protected land." David stepped forward, his satchel slung across one shoulder. "We've secured the trust deed and the letters from Mr. Daniels," he said. "They're airtight. The HOA's actions are a direct violation of state law." The governor's eyes hardened. "Then we'll treat it as such." He straightened, handing the splinter back to me like a symbol of what we would reclaim. "Karen Whitmore and her board have no idea what they've done, but they're about to find out." Before I could reply, the low hum of approaching vehicles reached us. I turned to see a caravan of SUVs and pickup trucks winding up the road. But these weren't government cars. A cluster of familiar faces rode in the beds of the trucks, their expressions taut with curiosity and nerves. The HOA board was arriving, drawn like moths to the flame of the governor's presence. At the head of the line, predictably, was Karen Whitmore. Her black luxury SUV came to a sharp stop near the clearing. Karen emerged in a tailored coat and dark sunglasses, her every movement radiating false confidence. But even from a distance, I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her posture as she spotted the governor. For a brief moment, her usual smirk faltered. "Governor Pierce," she said smoothly as she approached, removing her sunglasses. "What an unexpected honor." I wasn't aware the state took such a personal interest in neighborhood compliance. The governor's expression didn't soften. Mrs. Whitmore, is it? His voice carried the kind of calm that chilled more than a shout. I'm here because your association has committed an act of criminal trespass and destruction of state property. This land is not within your jurisdiction. Karen blinked, her practiced charm slipping. With all due respect, Governor, this property lies within the High Ridge boundaries. Our charter grants us authority over all homes and structures in this area. We followed proper procedure. The governor's tone cut like a blade. Did your procedure include verifying ownership records? Did it include confirming that this house sat on trust-protected land under the direct oversight of my office? Karen hesitated, a bead of sweat glistening at her temple, despite the cool mountain air. We acted on the information we had. Mr. Grant refused to pay repeated fines. We were left with no choice. Governor Pierce stepped closer, his towering presence forcing her back a half step. You brought bulldozers onto government property without a single state permit. You demolished a home built on trust land, and you believe that leaves you with no choice but to destroy it. His voice lowered to a dangerous calm. Mrs. Whitmore, you didn't enforce a charter. You committed a felony. The clearing fell silent. Even the birds seemed to pause, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again, her carefully constructed confidence unraveling like thread. Behind her, the other board members shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward one another in silent panic. David stepped in smoothly. Governor, the state attorney's office is prepared to issue an injunction today. We'll also be filing for seizure of HOA financial records. This will move quickly. Karen's face drained of color. Seizure? You can't. We can, the governor interrupted firmly. And we will. You've overstepped every legal boundary imaginable. By the time this investigation is complete, your association will be facing civil penalties, criminal charges, and the full cost of restitution for the damage you've caused. Karen tried to recover, her voice rising in brittle defiance. We acted in good faith. Our community depends on your community, Pierce said sharply, depends on the rule of law, and you just broke it. The governor turned away from her, dismissing her like an afterthought, and faced me instead. Mr. Grant, the state will take full responsibility for rebuilding your home and restoring the land. You have my word. I felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. Thank you, Governor, I managed. He nodded once, then addressed the security team. Escort Mrs. Whitmore and her board to their vehicles. They are not to interfere further. The Attorney General's office will contact them shortly. 2 uniformed officers stepped forward. Karen stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. But she didn't resist as they guided her back toward her SUV. The other board members followed in uneasy silence, their earlier bravado crumbling beneath the weight of the governor's presence. As the HOA vehicles retreated down the mountain road, a hush settled over the clearing. The only sounds were the soft sigh of wind through the pines and the distant echo of engines fading into the valley below. I turned to the governor, the tension in my shoulders finally easing. This isn't over, I said quietly. They'll fight this. They can try, the governor replied, his voice steady and sure. But the law is not on their side. What they did here will follow them for the rest of their lives. David joined us, holding the satchel that contained the trust documents. We'll begin the formal investigation today, he said. The Attorney General is already drafting charges. By the end of the week, the HOA's accounts will be frozen. They won't have the funds to challenge the state, let alone rebuild their credibility. The governor placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Let us handle the legal battle. Grant, your job now is to decide how you want to rebuild. For the first time since the bulldozers arrived, I felt something stronger than anger. My home had been reduced to rubble, but the mountain remained, solid and unbroken. And now the full weight of the state stood behind me. As the governor's convoy prepared to depart, I walked with him to the edge of the clearing. He paused before stepping into his SUV, turning to look once more at the ruins. They thought they could take down a house, he said quietly, almost to himself. But they brought down themselves instead. I watched as the vehicles descended the mountain, their black silhouettes disappearing into the trees. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine and the faint echo of justice in motion. Standing alone in the clearing, I felt the mountain breathe with me, steady, patient, and eternal. The HOA had thought they could break me. Instead, they had awakened a force far greater than they could comprehend. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I knew victory was inevitable. The mountain air was unnervingly still the morning the black SUVs appeared on the winding road. I had woken before dawn, restless from a night of broken sleep. Dreams of bulldozers tearing through the beams of my home played over and over in my mind, each one ending with the same crushing sound of wood splintering under steel. I stepped outside, hoping the icy air might clear my head, but the sudden crunch of tires on gravel made my stomach tighten. Through the rising mist, a convoy of sleek, dark vehicles climbed steadily toward my property. Their tinted windows reflected the pale light of morning, giving away nothing about who was inside. At first I thought they were reporters. News of the demolition had spread quickly, neighbors whispered, and a few online forums buzzed with outrage over what the HOA had done. But as the lead SUV stopped and the doors opened in perfect coordination, I realized these were not reporters. Men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the surroundings with practiced efficiency. Their movements were sharp and deliberate, their eyes sweeping the tree line and the dirt road behind them. They weren't journalists or curious locals, they were security. The rear door of the second SUV opened, and a tall man emerged, his presence commanding attention without a single word. Governor Alan Pierce? I recognized him instantly from televised addresses and campaign posters, but seeing him in person was entirely different. He wore a dark coat against the chill, his silver hair catching the weak sunlight. His face, lined with the experience of long years in politics, held a calm authority that made the chaos of the past days seem suddenly small. Behind him followed two aides carrying briefcases, their eyes fixed on the wreckage of what had once been my mountain mansion. The governor took a slow step toward the flattened ruin. He stopped at the edge of the rubble, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth where the bulldozers had scraped away the foundation. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sounds were the distant caw of a raven and the faint whine of wind weaving through the pines. Finally, he turned to me, his gray eyes steady. "Is this what they did?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the cold morning air. I nodded, my throat tight. "They came without warning. Bulldozers, trucks, they tore it down in a few hours." My voice cracked despite my efforts to stay composed. "The HOA claims I owed them fines. They said I had no right to resist." Governor Pierce's jaw tightened. He scanned the ruins again, taking in the splintered beams, the crushed stone, the twisted remains of the cedar porch I had built myself. His eyes lingered on the pieces of my life scattered across the dirt. A broken lamp, the shattered frame of a window I once admired during sunsets, and the remnants of my grandfather's old rocking chair. His silence grew heavier with each passing second. Behind me, the HOA president, Karen Whitmore, emerged from her silver sedan parked halfway down the road. I hadn't noticed her arrival, but of course she was here. Karen never missed an opportunity to display her authority. Her sharp blazer and perfectly styled hair contrasted sharply with the rugged mountain landscape. She approached cautiously, her confident stride tempered by the unexpected visitors. "Governor Pierce," she began, her voice carefully polished, "I wasn't expecting to see you here today. This is a private community matter." The governor turned to face her, his expression unreadable. A private matter. His voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the surface. "You brought heavy machinery onto protected state property and demolished a registered structure without consent or due process. Do you truly believe this is private?" Karen's carefully rehearsed smile faltered. "This land is under our jurisdiction," she said quickly, though her tone lacked its usual certainty. "The association has bylaws." The homeowner failed to comply with repeated notices. "We? You what?" Governor Pierce cut in, his voice rising just enough to freeze everyone in place. "You sent bulldozers onto land you do not own, without a single verified claim of authority. Did you confirm jurisdiction? Did you check state records before ordering this destruction?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. The governor's security detail moved closer, their presence suddenly more imposing. One of the aides opened a folder and handed Pierce a document. He glanced at it briefly before turning back to her. "This property," he said, tapping the page with one finger, "is held in a state-protected development trust. It is not, and has never been, subject to your HOA's bylaws. You had no legal right to issue fines, let alone demolish anything here." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Karen's face drained of color. She stammered, searching for a defense. We were told our maps." "Your maps were wrong," Pierce said coldly, "and your arrogance led you to destroy property belonging not only to this homeowner, but to the state itself." I stood rooted to the ground, torn between relief and disbelief. I had known the land had special protections, but I never imagined the governor himself would arrive to enforce them. Seeing Karen stripped of her smug confidence was almost surreal. She who once strutted through neighborhood meetings like a queen now stood trembling before the quiet fury of the state's highest authority. Pierce stepped closer to the ruins, motioning for one of his aides to begin photographing the site. "This is now an active investigation," he announced. "The state attorney's office will handle the matter from here. Ms. Whitmore, you and your board will provide every record of communication, every financial transaction, and every piece of correspondence related to this property, effective immediately. All HOA operations are suspended pending review." Karen's eyes widened. "Suspended? Governor, you can't?" "I can," Pierce interrupted, his voice firm. "And I will. Your actions have caused significant damage to state-protected property. You will answer for this in court." Karen tried again, but the words dissolved into a weak protest. Her usual sharp tone was gone, replaced by a trembling disbelief. "We didn't know," she finally whispered. "We thought it was part of the subdivision." "We were told intentions do not erase consequences," Pierce said, his tone softening only slightly. "Ignorance of the law does not protect you from it." The governor turned back to me, his expression gentler now. You'll need to provide a full account of the damages, he said. The state will pursue full restitution on your behalf. We'll also ensure your rights are permanently recorded and protected. No one will ever touch this land again without proper authority. A wave of relief washed over me, so sudden and overwhelming that I nearly staggered. For days I had felt powerless, watching everything I built reduced to rubble. Now, standing beside the governor of the state, I felt the weight begin to lift. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the first breath of justice. The governor's security team began marking the perimeter, placing small flags around the property for surveying. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing aerial footage for legal records. One of the aides asked me to walk them through the timeline of the demolition. As I spoke, describing the bulldozer's arrival, the cold efficiency of the crew, and the smug satisfaction on Karen's face, I felt the story shift from a personal tragedy to something larger, a clear, undeniable case of abuse of power. Karen stood off to the side, her phone in hand, no doubt frantically messaging the other board members. Her earlier bravado was gone. The sharp lines of her suit now seemed stiff and uncomfortable. Each passing minute deepened the realization that she was not in control. For years, she had wielded the HOA like a weapon, bullying homeowners with threats of fines and legal action. Now, the weapon had turned against her. By late morning, the mountain was alive with activity. State investigators arrived with measuring equipment and evidence bags. They photographed the crushed foundation, the torn electrical wiring, and the splintered cedar beams that once held up my living room ceiling. Every scrape of machinery and every chunk of shattered stone was carefully documented. I watched them work, a strange sense of satisfaction building with each click of the cameras. Governor Pierce stayed longer than I expected. He walked the property with quiet focus, occasionally pausing to ask questions about the original structure and the timeline of events. At one point, he placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We will hold them accountable," he said firmly. "This is not just about your home. It's about preventing this kind of overreach from happening anywhere else." As the sun began to sink behind the jagged peaks, the governor prepared to leave. The convoy of SUVs lined up once again, engines humming softly in the cool evening air. Before stepping into his vehicle, Pierce turned back to me. "You'll hear from my office within the week," he said. "Stay strong. The law is on your side." I nodded, my voice caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, Governor," I managed. He gave a small, reassuring smile before disappearing into the SUV. The convoy rolled down the mountain, leaving a quiet that felt different from the morning's stillness. This was not the silence of loss. It was the silence before a storm, the kind that sweeps away everything rotten and leaves the air clear. As I stood amid the wreckage of my home, I realized the balance of power had shifted. The HOA's grip on the mountain was broken, their arrogance exposed for the entire state to see. They had thought they could destroy my house and walk away unscathed. Instead, they had invited the full weight of the government onto their doorstep. And now, justice was no longer a distant hope. It was on its way, riding down the mountain in a convoy of black SUVs, leaving a trail of consequences that Karen Whitmore would never escape. The days following the governor's visit felt like the calm after a thunderstorm. The air on the mountain was still crisp and clean, but it carried a new electricity, a quiet promise of justice that hummed beneath every breeze. For the first time since the demolition, I slept soundly. The nightmare of bulldozers roaring through my cedar walls had finally given way to a steady rhythm of official action. Each morning, I awoke to the sounds of investigators and state contractors, not the crushing of stone and wood. Their measured movements and quiet conversations brought a strange comfort. Where chaos had ruled, order was taking root. The investigation unfolded with a precision that was almost beautiful. Teams of surveyors, lawyers, and engineers combed through every inch of my property, their clipboards and cameras capturing details that would later speak louder than any argument. They measured the depth of the bulldozer tracks, cataloged every broken beam, and collected soil samples where fuel had spilled during the demolition. Drones traced the scar of destruction from above, revealing a pattern of reckless force that no HOA defense could disguise. What once felt like a private tragedy now stood as undeniable evidence in a case that reached far beyond my mountain. Meanwhile, the HOA board found itself drowning in legal trouble. Word spread quickly through the community. Bank accounts were frozen, board meetings canceled, and subpoenas delivered with the swiftness of falling snow. Neighbors who once avoided conflict now whispered in the grocery store about fines they had quietly paid for years, wondering if they too had been victims of the board's overreach. Former homeowners came forward with stories of harassment, arbitrary rules, and financial intimidation. The illusion of authority that Karen Whitmore had carefully constructed was crumbling faster than the cedar beams of my demolished home. Karen herself seemed to shrink with each passing day. The woman who once strutted around neighborhood meetings with a smug smile and perfectly pressed blazer now avoided public appearances altogether. When she did surface, it was usually leaving the county courthouse with her attorney in tow, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. The sharp, commanding voice that once rang out at HOA meetings was replaced by hurried whispers and evasive comments. Every legal notice, every headline, tightened the walls around her like a noose. For me, The process was both vindicating and surreal. State attorneys met with me regularly, walking me through the mountain of evidence they were building. They showed me the HOA's internal emails, messages laced with arrogance and cruelty. In one, Karen bragged to another board member about making an example of me to discourage others from challenging their authority. In another, she openly dismissed the need to verify property boundaries before ordering the demolition, writing, "He'll never fight back. People like him never do." Each word was a nail in the coffin of their defense. Governor Pierce kept his promise to stay involved. His office worked tirelessly to ensure every legal avenue was pursued. He called me personally one evening to update me on the progress. "We're pushing for full restitution," he said, "not just for the property, but for the emotional and financial harm you've suffered. They will not walk away from this." His steady voice carried a weight that grounded me, a reminder that I was no longer fighting alone. As the legal case built momentum, plans to rebuild my home began to take shape. State architects arrived with blueprints and proposals, funded by an emergency grant that came directly from the penalties levied against the HOA standing. On the empty lot where my mansion once stood, I watched them unfurl drawings of a new house, more beautiful and more resilient than the one I had lost. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a future on the mountain. The court date arrived on a bright spring morning. The courthouse buzzed with tension as reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing as board members shuffled inside. I sat with my attorney, a quiet determination settling over me as we entered the packed courtroom. Karen sat at the defense table, her posture rigid but her eyes betraying fear. Her once perfect hair was hastily tied back, her expression a mask of forced calm. The state's case was devastating. They presented maps, survey records, and property deeds, proving the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land. They played recordings of board meetings where members discussed teaching a lesson to non-compliant homeowners. They read aloud the email where Karen mocked my refusal to pay their fabricated fines. Each piece of evidence stripped away the last remnants of their defense, leaving only the raw truth. They had acted with reckless disregard for the law. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. The judge's voice was firm and deliberate as she announced that the HOA and its board members were guilty of unlawful destruction of property, trespassing, and conspiracy to defraud. They were ordered to pay full restitution for the damages, legal fees, and additional penalties to the state for violating protected land statutes. Karen herself faced criminal charges, including willful destruction of state-protected property, a felony that carried the possibility of prison time. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me as the words sank in. Months of frustration, fear, and anger melted into a quiet, powerful sense of justice. This wasn't just a win for MIT, it was a warning to anyone who believed they could wield power without accountability. The HOA's reign of intimidation was over, their authority reduced to a cautionary tale for communities across the state. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed me with microphones and flashing cameras. "How does it feel to win?" one asked. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "This isn't just my victory," I said. "It's a reminder that no one is above the law. Power doesn't give you the right to destroy someone's life. Today proves that justice still matters." Governor Pierce approached soon after, offering a firm handshake and a proud smile. "You stood your ground," he said quietly. "Because of you, others will be protected from this kind of abuse." His words carried the weight of truth, and for a moment, I felt the mountain itself breathe with relief. In the weeks that followed, rebuilding began in earnest. Construction crews worked with a speed and care that mirrored the state's commitment to making things right. Each day brought new progress. A foundation poured, walls framed, cedar beams rising once more against the sky. Neighbors who had once watched from a distance now stopped by with kind words and offers of help. Some admitted they had lived in fear of the HOA for years. "You gave us the courage to speak up," one elderly couple told me, their eyes bright with gratitude. By the time summer arrived, the first level of the new mansion stood proudly against the mountain backdrop. Stronger and more beautiful than before, it symbolized more than a home. It was proof that resilience can outlast destruction, and that justice, though slow, is unyielding. Standing on the new porch one evening, I watched the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold. The mountain was quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of loss. It was the peace of a hard-won victory. Karen and her board, meanwhile, faced the full consequences of their actions. Their personal assets were seized to pay restitution. Their names appeared in newspapers as examples of unchecked authority gone wrong. Karen's once proud voice, the one that had ordered bulldozers to my door, was now heard only in courtrooms and legal depositions. The woman who had tried to break me was left to face a future defined by the very laws she once ignored. As my new home neared completion, I realized the mountain had given me something far greater than revenge. It had given me strength, clarity, and a story worth sharing. What began as a personal tragedy had become a lesson in standing firm against injustice. I had lost a house, but in the end, I gained something that no bulldozer could destroy. The undeniable truth that courage and persistence can overcome even the most powerful opponents. Today, As I sit on my new cedar porch and listen to the wind through the pines, I feel a deep gratitude. The HOA tried to crush me, but they only built the foundation for something stronger. Justice was served, and the mountain stands free once more. For more incredible real-life stories like this, watch my videos on brightreality. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality to never miss the next powerful story of justice and truth.